A sinister discovery in a metal suitcase shocked the police of Yorkshire in January 2002, the body of a young Korean woman. This horrific find marked the beginning of an investigation that led to the trail of one of the country's most chilling killers. His name is Kim Kyuso, a native of South Korea, born in 1971 or 1972. Little is known about his life before this, except that in September 2001, after an unsuccessful marriage, he left his homeland and went to London with the intention of studying English in the capital of the United Kingdom. However, already in October 2001, Kim quit his studies and started earning a living by renting out 2 apartments, one on Eagle Street near Holborn, known as the legal quarter of London, and a duplex on Gaster Street in the Poplar area. To get his business off the ground, he placed ads for his services on several websites. Most of his tenants were visiting students, many of them Koreans like Kim himself. At that time, he had a girlfriend, Marika Ijimura, a young Japanese woman who worked as a hairdresser. Marika occupied the main bedroom of the apartment on Eagle Street, while 2 Korean female tenants shared the second room. Those who knew Kim usually described him as a benevolent, polite and pleasant man with a constant smile on his face. He was charming with everyone, but especially with young girls. Somehow he managed to convince people that he came from a wealthy family and had a good financial standing and lifestyle himself. However, this was all just an illusion. In reality, Kim's financial affairs were in absolute disarray. He had huge debts hanging over him, and all his credit cards were blocked. Moreover, he and Marika often used prohibited By September 2001, their relationship seemed to have reached a dead end. And the young woman, who was almost 10 years younger than Kim, was hardly ever seen in the apartment. It was under these circumstances that Kim met Hyunjong, a girl from a South Korean province who rented a room from him for just 3 days. Jean was studying French literature at a Korean university and had spent several months at the University of Lyon in France as part of an exchange program. After finishing her studies, she decided to stay for a few more days to see the sights of Paris and London before returning home, where her brother and parents were waiting for her. Jean arrived in the British capital on Wednesday, October 24, 2001, and was supposed to return to France on Saturday, October 27. She found Kim's ad on the internet and agreed with him to rent a room in the apartment on Eagle Street. However, the girl's plans were interrupted in the most terrible way, and her young life was cut short suddenly and tragically. On the evening of October 26, a day before her scheduled return to France, the 19-year-old student became a victim of Kim's brutal attack. The exact details of what happened were never revealed, but it is known that when they were alone, the man took Jin's life by wrapping her face with duct tape so that she could not breathe. He also tied her wrists. Before subjecting the girl to these tortures, Kim, threatening forced Jean, who seemed to offer no resistance, to tell him the PIN codes for her credit cards, information he was going to use later. Then he stuffed her body into a metal suitcase and hid it in a closet in the main bedroom. The corpse lay there for the next 5 days. When other residents returned to the apartment on Friday and asked where Jean was, Kim lied that she had decided to return to France a day early and that he had allegedly taken her to the train station. He told a similar story, with some variations, to the girl's friends and relatives, who began to sound the alarm when Jean did not return to France on time and actually disappeared without a trace. On Saturday, October 27, a day after committing the horrific crime, Kim took both of his victims' cards and began to empty her bank accounts. First, he tried to withdraw money from a card of the South Korean Kookmin Bank, which was linked to a family account. It had been opened by Jin's parents for emergencies, and the girl herself had never used it. The first theft attempt failed because Kim entered the wrong PIN code. But a few days later, he tried again and managed to withdraw £1,990. Kim tried to withdraw more, but Jin's family account was already empty. The other card was issued by a French bank where the girl kept her personal savings while living in France. Kim handed this card to a young Korean woman and asked her to go to Paris to withdraw as much cash as possible from the card. Although such a request should have aroused suspicion, Kim managed to deceive the girl by saying that the card belonged to his girlfriend Marika and by making up a plausible reason why he urgently needed money. Apparently, his explanation sounded convincing enough for the girl to agree to carry out his request. But in reality, there was a much more sinister intent behind it. Kim did not just want to take possession of all his victims' money, but also sought to reinforce his lie that Jean had supposedly gone to Paris. To do this, he needed to create the illusion that the girl had used her card in the French capital. He hoped to confuse the police, who would inevitably start investigating the student's sudden disappearance, with false leads. Late in the evening on Wednesday, October 31st, Kim put the suitcase with Jin's body in the trunk of a rented car. Then he drove for almost 4 hours to the village of Uskrik in North Yorkshire. There, on the side of a deserted road, he threw out the suitcase with Jin's mutilated corpse and returned to his apartment. Kim pretended as if nothing had happened. He continued to rent out rooms and repeated the same false explanations whenever one of the victim's acquaintances asked about her. Between November 17th and 18th, a young Korean woman named Song In-hea moved into Kim's duplex on Gaster Street. At first, she shared the main bedroom with a friend named Moon, but already on November 29th, Moon had to return to her native Korea, and Song remained alone in the apartment. Everyone who knew Song described her as a friendly and smiling girl, and in her family, she was considered an exemplary daughter. There are some discrepancies regarding what exactly she was doing in London. According to some reports, she was studying hotel management, while others say she came to learn English after studying at a Korean university. While Song was living in the duplex, she and Kim became very close, although it is not known for certain whether there was any romantic or relationship between them. However, some people who saw them together said that they behaved like brother and sister. In addition, Song's friend later recounted that the girl had once let slip that she felt a special affection from Kim. But she never once hinted that these feelings were mutual. However, on December 3, 2001, Kim suddenly asked all the residents of the apartment on Eagle Street to move out, including Marika, with whom he no longer had a relationship at that time. Then he himself left the apartment and moved into the duplex on Gaster Street, where Song lived. For the next few days, they were very close. And the girl did not even suspect that a real monster was hiding behind the mask of friendliness. Song was last seen alive on December 7, when she had lunch with Kim at a Korean restaurant. She had no idea what a terrible fate would befall her in just a few hours. Kim dealt with Song as insidiously and cruelly as he had with Jean a few months before. He tied her wrists and ankles with duct tape, stuffed a sock in her mouth, and then sealed her mouth and nose. As a result, the 22-year-old girl slowly and painfully suffocated. Acting according to an already proven scheme, Kim took care to find out his victim's bank details before putting his monstrous plan into action. Then he hid her body in a closet in the duplex hallway and sealed the door so that no one could open it. Song's remains lay there for several months. When the girl's acquaintances asked where she was, Kim replied that she had supposedly gotten a job at a hotel and was now living in a dormitory for the staff. As it turned out, Song In-hea had 2 bank accounts, one with British NatWest, and the other with Korean Kookmin Bank. The latter was a joint family account for emergencies, which the girl had used only once in her life. Kim Kyuso used the NatWest card to withdraw £240 in cash from an ATM. With this money, he bought a ticket to Toronto, where he flew on December 13. But before leaving, the insidious killer also robbed his victim's account at the Korean bank, stealing a total of £1,200. Kim managed to get to Toronto without any problems. There he rented an apartment and again started renting out rooms, reproducing the same business model as in London. The man planned to stay in Canada for a year or two, and it seemed that he had managed to avoid punishment for these terrible crimes. But in reality, the story was far from over. While Kim continued to live his normal life after strangling Jean and getting rid of her body in a suitcase, the girl's loved ones did not stop looking for her. When Jean did not return from England at the appointed time, her worried friends in France contacted her relatives in Korea. Trying in vain to find the missing girl, her brother posted information about her on a Korean website dedicated to the search for missing persons. It was there that her photograph was later seen by a Korean policeman who was studying in London at the time. The fact that Jean turned out to be one of many missing Korean students caught the officer's attention, because just a few days before, news reports had mentioned the discovery of the lifeless body of a young Asian woman stuffed into a suitcase. The gruesome find was made on January 18, although, as it later turned out, the suitcase was first noticed 2 weeks earlier. However, since this happened in a sparsely populated rural area, no one ever reported it to the authorities. Until one of the local residents tried to take the suitcase and was surprised at how heavy it was. This seemed extremely suspicious to the man. When the police arrived at the scene in the middle of the night and shined a flashlight on the suitcase, they saw human hair and eyes through the cracks. The horrifying luggage was urgently taken to the morgue of North Yorkshire, where it was finally opened. Inside, they found the body of a girl, almost completely naked, except for a bra. The victim's height barely exceeded 150 centimeters, and her head and limbs were tightly wrapped with adhesive tape. The investigators' attention was immediately drawn to the unusual decoration of the tape used. It was a decorative dark blue tape manufactured by 3M with a distinctive print in the form of male faces. As the police soon found out, this tape was designed by London artists Gilbert and George, and it went on sale in September 2000. It was sold exclusively in the souvenir shops of the Tate Gallery in London, Liverpool and Cornwall. In total, according to the investigation, 851 rolls were sold. This information would later prove extremely important for solving the crime. Examining the body, the pathologist was struck by the absence of any signs of struggle on the part of the victim. This led him to think that the girl had probably been drugged before being tied up. The expert suggested two possible scenarios: either there was some unknown substance in the victim's body that was not detected during the toxicological analysis, or the girl was somehow deceived or threatened to allow her hands to be tied. The forensic examination began with a study of the hair, which confirmed that the deceased was from Southeast Asia. However, the police were unable to identify her by fingerprints using the national database. The investigators were able to establish the victim's identity only on January 2, 2002. This happened after the Korean policeman, who had seen the missing person report for Jean and learned about the body found in the suitcase, contacted the Yorkshire police to inform them of a possible connection between these events. The British law enforcement officers contacted the Korean embassy and gained access to the fingerprint database of South Korean citizens. The comparison made it possible to find out that the deceased was none other than Jean Hyunjong. And shortly before that, on December 17, 2001, the police had also declared Song In-hea wanted after her alarmed friends reported her disappearance. So on January 7, 2002, when the Serious Crime Directorate of the Metropolitan Police learned about the discovery of Jin's body, investigators suspected that both incidents might be related. Thus, the North Yorkshire Police and detectives from London began a joint investigation under the leadership of Chief Constable Alan Ankers. Since Song was initially considered simply missing, and her body had not yet been found, the investigators decided to start with Jin's case. Thanks to information obtained from the deceased's friends and relatives, the police were able to track her movements up to her arrival at the apartment on Eagle Street. During a search of the dwelling, they found a whole roll of the exact same adhesive tape that Jean had been bound and strangled with. On the sticky side of the tape, as well as on the baseboards, walls, sofa and carpet in the room, experts found traces of the young Korean woman's blood. As for the missing Song In-hea, the investigation knew that the girl had last rented a room in a house on Gaster Street. After carefully analyzing all the connections between the residents of this house, as well as the apartment on Eagle Street, the police found out that both dwellings were run by none other than Kim Kyuso, who was already in Canada at that time. Having studied the records of the suspect's telephone conversations, the investigators established that during the period when the suitcase with the body was thrown out in North Yorkshire, he was just in that area. And during an inspection of the car that Kim had rented in October 2001, criminalists found traces of Jin's blood. All the evidence found unambiguously indicated that both crimes had been committed by one and the same person. So the police finally had their main suspect, Kim Kyuso. On January 17, 2002, the Metropolitan Law Enforcement officers, together with the North Yorkshire Police, held a press conference urging the public to provide any information about the two missing girls. And in the evening of the same day, fate played a cruel joke on the killer himself. Kim, who had just returned to London, carelessly went to an internet cafe, where he was recognized and arrested. The man was charged with the murder of Hyunjong and taken into custody. On January 21, the suspect appeared before the magistrate's court. His lawyer petitioned for release on bail, but the judge rejected this request. Kim was left in custody until the start of the trial, scheduled for the 28th of the same month. However, as often happens, the date of the hearing was later postponed. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation into the missing Song In-hea. And on March 14, 2002, there was an unexpected breakthrough in the case. A builder named Paul Min, who was carrying out repair work in one of the rooms of the duplex on Gaster Street, noticed that a strange number of flies were flying out from under the decorative panels. This seemed suspicious to the man, and he immediately reported it to the police. The next day, investigators arrived at the scene. While inspecting the dwelling, they noticed a sealed wall cabinet in the hallway. When the police officers opened it, they saw inside a pile of stinking clothes, and behind it, a naked female body wrapped in a sheet. The examination later confirmed that the remains found belonged to the missing Song In-hea. Interestingly, the investigators had already visited this duplex on January 9, 2002, during a previous search. But then they only found things that belonged to Jean, the first victim. The police officers somehow did not notice the sealed cabinet with the second body at that time. The forensic experts found that the adhesive tape that Song's face, wrists and ankles were wrapped with was identical to the one the killer had used in Jin's case. However, this time Kim had squeezed the lower part of the victim's face with such force that her eyes nearly popped out of their sockets. However, despite all the killer's cruelty, no signs of sexual violence were found on the bodies of either girl. Additional DNA testing of Song In-hea's personal belongings found in the same cabinet showed that some of them, including clothes and shoes, actually belonged to Jean. On April 4, 2002, Kim Kyuso was officially charged with the murder of Song In-hea. On May 7, the man was to appear before the Central Criminal Court to give evidence. At this hearing, he refused through an interpreter to admit his guilt in the intentional murder of both girls, both Jean and Song. Although the start of the full trial was scheduled for September 30 of the same year, in fact, the substantive consideration of the case began only in March 2003. At the same time, Kim refused to answer any questions during the cross-examination and did not want to testify in court at all. However, on the second day of the hearing, in the presence of the jury, the defendant did confess to the unintentional killing of Song In-hea. He claimed that it was just an unsuccessful erotic game that led to an accidental tragedy. But the court rejected this formulation of guilt. The trial continued. Kim Kyuso was never able to explain what prompted him to commit these monstrous crimes. In his speech before the jury, prosecutor Jonathan LeBlanc voiced several possible motives of the defendant. In his opinion, Kim could have been pushed to the murders by psychosexual problems or banal greed, because the man was suffering from debts. It is also possible that the strangler simply derived sadistic pleasure from the slow and painful taking of life of his victims. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.